I'm not entirely sure how I pulled this off, but there is so much science in this video, y'all. So much. All kinds of cognitive psychology just sprinkled throughout. And a solitary Peterson reference that's part of a bit of a philosophical aside that completely derails his point. Woo! This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi, welcome back to this cognitive psychologist who is absolutely stoked that I get to work in some cognitive into this video. Gotta take these opportunities where I can, especially when there's so much Freud to be handled in this one. Spoilers. We're saving the part 1 refresh for a little bit and you'll see why. But I will remind you now that this chapter on not hiding unwanted things in the fog is specifically targeted at people in married relationships. If you're not married, but you are in a relationship, sorry, I guess. Although I suppose if you are crafty, you could probably apply the core part of the advice here to your relationships, but it's still an interesting choice to target this at people who are married. Cursory channel business. You can support your humble edutainer by giving the video a like, subscribing to the channel, giving me your patronage on Patreon or through PayPal, or picking up my merch. We still have the hoodies with the Chaos Dragon, citation needed. We got mugs, koozies are new, so ooh, cold drinks. I've got beanies on the way for test prints, so those will be soon, and pedantic pants and other things, so expect that to drop soon. If there's anything else you guys would want, leave a comment below. And to address the red polka dot elephant that may or may not be picking up on camera, I have red bumps on this hand. I don't know why. They might be chilblains from getting my hand too cold and this is just how I react to things now, or they might be something else, I don't know. It's a mystery. But hey, I can ask my rheumatologist about it because I finally got that booked in April. This is fine. And finally, a quick refresher for the visual shorthand indicating where ideas are coming from. This means I'm paraphrasing the book, this means I'm responding to the book, or integrating my thoughts with science. Cognitive science even. And also talking about that one reference Peterson deigned to honor us with this time. And also talking about a portion of psychology I wish Peterson would leave as a historical relic. Allez video! Before we even get into this section, I want to remind you about the whole sins of commission and omission thing from 12 Rules, because we are going to revisit it here. The first time he really explained this was in Rule 8, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. It was in the context of Alfred Adler's life lies, which are generally defined by other people as a false belief around which an individual's life is built. Peterson seemed to not quite be using the term entirely correctly in 12 Rules, as he emphasized the lying involved with supporting the false belief rather than the belief itself. But his reference was to a book chapter that isn't accessible online, and there's only so many rabbit holes I can fall down in one video, and this is not going to be one of them. Max is giving himself a bath in the background here, so the mouth noises are not my fault for at least a little bit. If you watch my videos on that rule, you may remember the part about someone wanting to retire and drink margaritas on the beach, and Peterson's displeasure with that plan because there's no way a person could be happy doing that, followed by the ideologue rant. The sins came into his lifeline discussion by saying he regards sin of omission, an action resulting in something bad, to be as bad, if not potentially worse, than sins of commission, action resulting in something bad. His example was someone omissioning by not standing up for herself and suffering for it, followed by a little doom with being the well-greased wheel ultimately not saving you when groups start getting sacrificed. This is in the Speaking Truth chapter, as you need to be able to say a truthful no to others, lest you become a gulag guard, among other less terrible outcomes. If you aren't speaking the truth, you are weakening your character, and that's probably enough of a 12 Rules refresher to hit the ground running in beyond order. Sort of. We start this section on corruption with me feeling like I already missed a step. Quote, this is right at the beginning. Corruption of the form we are discussing is, in my opinion, integrally linked to deception. Thing is, what corruption discussion? We're going to assume he's using the second meaning of corruption that touches on morality, although given the broader context of what's been talked about in the previous chapters, the first could potentially work too. Okay, so we were apparently talking about decaying morals in the context of communication with your spouse. Time for that recap. The first section of this chapter was about Peterson's father-in-law getting fed up at his wife's choice of sandwich plate after many, many years, and how the accumulation of little annoyances can be bad for the marriage overall. The second section focused on a former client who was married to someone apparently pretty far up his own ass. Peterson focused on the clash in their decorating styles that he insisted were there despite his client saying she didn't mind the husband's pop art hoard. No, Peterson knew it bugged her and that her minimalist preference was actually her inability to put forward her wants. Peterson wasn't happy that his client never angrily confronted her husband about this or destroyed his things. Instead, he described her stewing in her resentment and repression, which only hurt the marriage. He closed out this section by trying to scare the reader into directly confronting relationship trouble by saying troubles will only repeat if not addressed. That relationships can fall apart for other reasons, but not working to address the unwanted things will result in repeating small hell. And finally, that it's more difficult to address these unwanted things, but it is important to do so for both your family and society. So, where's the corruption discussion in that? I suppose the closest we came was in this part, with the sins of men helping speed the demise of relationships, but that seems a far cry from depravity. But of course, this is Peterson we're reading, and there are no small acts in the Lobsterverse. Not addressing those small relationship annoyances will help bring about the fall of traditional Western civilization. Somehow. That's probably enough of that aside. Let's start actually working through this section, shall we? Wherever the heck he meant by corruption is linked to lying to ourselves. He says, quote, "Strict logicians regard self-deception as an impossibility because believing a thing and its opposite at the same time should be impossible. But silly logicians don't know psychology, and they must not have noticed when they've simultaneously loved and hated a family member at the same time." Then he sets about to pick apart this hypothetical logician he set up.
Furthermore, it is not obvious what believe means when discussing human belief, nor what is meant by simultaneously. I can believe one thing today and another tomorrow, and very often get away with it, at least in the short term.
It's pretty rich that Peterson, a person with near unmatched skill in flipping the intended word usage on a dime, often repeatedly, is criticizing unclear meanings from a fictional logician, especially after he dropped that corruption bomb on us. And now, dear viewer, the reason why I opted not to join Adler down that first rabbit hole. A more well-known psychoanalyst is being called in.
There are many conditions or circumstances under which self-deception can theoretically occur. Psychoanalysts have explored many of these, with Freud leading the way.
That's right. It's Freud time. Not even 100 pages in, and he's whipping out Freud with nary a reference in sight. Just to get this out of the way before we get into the weeds. No. Freudian theory? No. More detailed knowing, but still no. That Peterson's going to spend so much time on Freud's theories just to swoop in and minorly criticize him vexes me to no end.
Freud believed that much of mental illness was due to repression, which is arguably and reasonably considered a form of self-deception. For him, memories of traumatically troubling events were unconsciously banished to perdition in the unconscious, where they rattled around and caused trouble, like poltergeists in a dungeon.
Freud may have believed that, but surprise, that's not the modern understanding of where mental health problems come from. A genetic predisposition, brain chemistry, trauma, things of those nature, sure. But repressed memories? No. Peterson not contextualizing this could be called another form of deception. As a note, for hitting the Freud basics, we're largely going to be pulling from the textbook I used for intro psych in my adjuncting days, because, it's the damnedest thing, but there hasn't really been movement on Freud for a while. I wonder why that could be. According to Freud, the mind is made up of 3 parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id has your most basic drives and operates under the pleasure principle. If it were in control, you'd be feeding, fighting, and fucking your way through life. The superego is somewhat in opposition to your id. This is sort of your conscience that was inculcated in you by your parents. The superego works under the idealistic principle. If you're behaving as you should in your culture, you get to feel good about yourself. If you're naughty, guilt and remorse time. Last is the ego. This is the part that works through the reality principle, as it's having to balance the id's drives with the superego's rules in the real world. The relative balance of these three forces was said to be what determined your personality structure. Are you very id heavy, superego heavy? Do you have a good balance? Just what's the relationship between those three? Anxiety, defined as the unpleasant sensation you get after having unwanted thoughts or feelings, comes from the interactions between those three components. Anxiety doesn't feel good, so the ego goes into defense mode to reduce it. We'll go through a couple other examples when Peterson gets to Freud's defense mechanisms, but for now, just know that repression is one of them. With repression, a negative memory, feeling, thought, whatever, is yeeted out of your conscious mind down into your unconscious so you don't have to feel it anymore. But it can't just stay lost down there. Freud proposed it would, as Peterson described, rattle around and cause trouble, resulting in mental health problems. Part of psychoanalytic therapy, then, is to unyeet those things out of the unconscious so that you can exorcise those poltergeists. Last little part here from the Science Corner. Empirical support for the mind or personality structure Freud put forward is scant. Similar to Jung, it can be a useful metaphor for thinking about how we work or explaining our drives or whatever, but go beyond the metaphor and the utility is limited. A frustrating part here is he argued somewhat against repression in 12 Rules, while talking about the client who wasn't sure if she'd been sexually assaulted or not in Rule 9. Assume the person you're listening to knows something you don't. He very clearly wrote against the therapeutic practice of recovering memories, meaning a situation where a client is inadvertently or intentionally coached to fill in details for something in their past they can't remember and ultimately recover a false memory. And the way those memories are posited to get buried in the first place? Fucking repression.
Freud understood that the human personality was not unitary. Instead, it consists of a loose, fragmented cacophony of spirits who do not always agree or even communicate. The truth of this claim is self-evident, at least in one simple manner. We can think about things. We can simulate potential or alternative actions or events without immediately having to act them out.
Just because Pearson can somehow take Freud's personality structure as being self-evidently true because we have imaginations, doesn't make Freud's personality theory correct. I have to assume Freud's mind trifecta of the id, ego, and superego is what Pearson's referring to with the loose, fragmented cacophony of spirits, because it seems really weird to call the three parts that. It would be a better fit for the Jungian archetypes, but we are clearly not talking about those. How the id, ego, superego are self-evidently correct from our ability to imagine the outcomes from actions is a mystery to me.
Dissociation of thought and action is necessary for abstract thought even to exist. Thus, we can clearly think or say one thing and do another.
Maybe it's different in counseling, but in cognitive, when we're talking about abstract thought, we're talking about how tangible something is. Let me explain. We can roughly break down thoughts or concepts into two boxes. So yes, dear viewer, this is an opportunity to put things into two boxes that Peterson missed. Anyways, concrete or abstract? Concrete things would be the stuff that you can go out and touch. People, objects, physical things, although you probably shouldn't just go touching people. Anyways, doesn't matter if it's actually in front of you right now or not, it's still a concrete thing. Abstract things are the intangibles. So these would be things like feelings, concepts, or constructs. Justice would be an example. These are no touchy, ever. There are important cognitive differences for these two categories. For example, we have an easier time processing concrete things than abstract. It seems like he's using the term abstract in a different manner. Like, instead of intangible things, he means thoughts that aren't immediately acted out, which just ain't it.
This is fine when merely thinking prior to acting, but perhaps not so good when we promise or claim to believe something and then act in a manner indicating that we truly have faith in something else. This is a form of deception. A disjunction in character, a contradiction between modes of being. It has even been named. To claim one belief and then to act or speak in a different or even opposite manner constitutes a performative contradiction, according to certain modern philosophers. An implicit lie, in my opinion.
When I come across a term in these books I'm not familiar with, the first thing I do is just look it up. In part to check what Peterson's saying, but also just to find out what this thing is independent of him. Even before I look at what his reference is. This time that process led me to a wiki logic stub that provided a clearer example of a performative contradiction. A person saying, I am dead, because if they're saying that, they obviously aren't. They performed a contradiction. But then the wiki goes into territory that honestly sends my brain into chickens on the moon mode with nitty-gritty philosophy stuff. But hey, Habermas's book that's on the further reading list just so happens to be Peterson's reference here. I quickly read through it on the Internet Archive, and it seems to largely be about supporting moral philosophical arguments, with the side of the whole is versus ought thing. The interesting part to me is what's highlighted now. Habermas claims that postmodernism's epistemological relativism suffers from a performative contradiction. Now, I didn't see that exact wording present in this chapter or things that felt close to that, nor did I see anything calling out postmodernists. But I'm not a philosopher, so could have missed something in the jargon. The part that's interesting to me here is it just so happened to work out that this author is described as criticizing postmodernists, which seems to be one of Peterson's favorite hobbies. Apparently the concept of a performative contradiction may directly be framed as an attack against postmodern philosophy because of philosophical reasons. I can't begin to describe how difficult it is for my brain to wrap around philosophy. My instinct here was to also launch into a thing on cognitive dissonance, which is a state you can end up in when your thoughts, beliefs, and or actions don't match up. But on further reflection, I don't think it's quite getting at the same thing. Cognitive dissonance involves a feeling of negative tension when you notice the mismatch and the steps you take to relieve that tension. The performative contradiction seems to be more neutral for the performer, like they're blithely unaware of the mismatch. But this could be down to a difference between the general operating spheres of philosophy and psychology. A question remains though. Why does this, out of all the things he could be backing up in this chapter, this philosophical aside, get a reference? I do appreciate Peterson flagging his opinion here. It'd be nice if he hedged things like this more often. The thing I'm struggling with here though is how directly this performative contradiction impacts day-to-day life. From what I read, and had explained to me, it seems to operate in the disconnected philosophical sphere rather than a description of how we generally think. And maybe that's why my instinct was to reach for cognitive dissonance, because then we're talking about empirical data for how people behave. But we are deeply into a singular weed at this point, so let's get back out to the weeds, if not the actual path.
The holding of contradictory beliefs also becomes a problem when the holder attempts to act out both simultaneously and discovers, often to his or her great chagrin, the paradox that makes such an attempt impossible.
Back into the cognitive dissonance weeds it is then. As I mentioned, cognitive dissonance is the icky feeling you find yourself having when there is an incongruence between your thoughts, actions, or beliefs. The demonstration for this is pretty easy. Would you, dear viewer, say that you care about topic? That topic could be world hunger, climate change, women's reproductive rights, trans rights. Any number of topics will work for this. This next part assumes that you've answered in the affirmatory to caring. Have you actually done something directly to address it? No matter how much you're actually doing, you probably just got hit with a gnawing little sense of, ugh. That nasty little feeling is the dissonance. And now quickly for all the SIGINs out there, here's an emergency debrief. Please remember, your ability to actually individually drive the change needed on these topics is limited, and that's okay. Don't feel bad for not having the reach of someone like Milan Husk. Do what you can in your part of the world to make things better, and you're doing good. Okay, so dissonance is not fun, so we naturally do things to try and alleviate it, and we do that by getting things consistent again. We can get that consistency a couple ways. For a working example, let's take someone who's experiencing some cognitive dissonance about smoking cigarettes. One way to get consistency would be to change the behavior. In this case, quit smoking. Or they can try to rationalize and justify the behavior by way of changing their thoughts. The nicotine helps me concentrate, so I need to keep smoking. Or you can try to balance the books a bit by bringing other things in. So I can keep smoking, but I have to give up drinking. Another option is the uncomfy info that butted up against the previously existing thoughts can just be ignored or disputed. The dangers of smoking are overblown, so I'm fine. In many instances, such as with smoking, it's easier to change the cognitions than behaviors. Back to Peterson's quote. We are crafty little creatures. We don't blue screen at this so-called paradox. We do something to resolve the dissonance, thereby negating the paradox, and move on with our lives. Even if that something is just to stick our head in the sand and ignore important info. And no, Peterson's next paragraph isn't linked with ways we try to deal with this paradox. He just left this apparently impossible paradox in our laps with no indication for what happens next. Before we move on, I want to point out an aggravating detail. If it wasn't for one of his 2 fucking references in this chapter being wrapped up in this performative contradiction thing, I just wouldn't have talked about it at all. We got into this as a weird aside from the alleged self-evident truth of Freud's personality theory, and we're going to go back into other aspects of Freud's theories. The performative contradiction shit has next to nothing to do with any of that. It's a literal aside that should have been seen as such by an editor and cut. The next paragraph is Peterson listing off, and in a shocking deviation from the norm, giving examples of some of Freud's defense mechanisms, which he calls, quote, phenomena akin to repression, the active rejection of potentially conscious psychological material from awareness. Now, the full list of the defense mechanisms isn't really super relevant to this video, so if you'd like to hear more about those, you can check out my Freud video. It is time to pick up the Freudian anxiety pin. In his theory, you've got the id and you've got the superego, each pulling with their own drives and what they want you to do. Stuck in the middle is your ego, trying to figure out what's best under the reality principle. And as I said earlier, this tension between these 3 is felt as anxiety. Anxiety isn't fun, so the ego tries to yeet those feelings through the defense mechanism so you just don't have to feel it. A couple quick examples before the big one. One would be projection, where your own negative feelings, motives, or impulses are attributed onto others. I'm not the one trying to kill free speech, it's all those activists. Another would be sublimation, where socially unacceptable thoughts, feelings, and drives are sublimated into a socially acceptable one. So a person's drive to hurt people is sublimated into a UFC career. And then there's repression. Socially unacceptable thoughts, feelings, drives, or negative memories get shoved down into your unconscious mind where your conscious ego doesn't have access to them, so you can't feel it anymore. But they can fester, and then they cause mental health problems, according to Freud. The important thing to keep in mind here is we don't have evidence that memory works this way. But here's Peterson talking about like it's a valid explanation of how memory and mental health works. And just to be pedantic, the defense mechanisms aren't akin to repression. Repression is one of the defense mechanisms. What's he even doing here? He praises Freud for going there and, quote, pointing out the relationship between dishonesty and psychopathology. But he does see 2 little flaws with Freud's work on self-deception. Before we get to Peterson actually going through with the 2-item numbered list, I just want to reiterate the what the fuckery of just laying out this purported link between lying and mental health problems. That, in itself, is manipulative. We know Peterson is against people lying no matter what, but to try and pull this shit, that liars are going to be mentally unwell? What was that rule in the last book? Yes. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. How about you take some of your own advice, Peterson?
First error. Freud failed to notice that sins of omission contributed to mental illness as much as, or more than, the sins of commission listed above that constitute repression. In doing so, he merely thought in the typical manner. People generally believe that actively doing something bad, that is the sin of commission, is, on average, worse than passively not doing something good, that is the sin of omission. Perhaps this is because there are always good things we are not doing. Some sins of omission are therefore inevitable.
Right, sure. We're just going to move forward with Freud's mental illness lying link as the foundational argument. Love that. Also, the shade of Peterson calling Freud a typical thinker here. Not our lobster daddy. No, he's a much more sophisticated thinker than Freud. Yes, he is. Peterson spends the rest of the paragraph arguing why sins of omission, quote, produce more serious catastrophes, end quote, that are also easier to wipe our conscience, and conscience probably, clean from. When you do a commission sin, then you have to repress knowledge of that action. But when you are willfully blind about something, he says you basically plausible deniability'd yourself into not finding out the knowledge of the sin by not trying to find out more, which he points out can still be a crime. His only example for any of this is here, with a CEO suspecting their money guy is doing something funny with the accounting books, but not looking into it to keep their hands clean. More examples would have made what he's trying to convey here more clear. What are the more serious catastrophes that come from the omission sins? Give me an example of someone actually repressing the knowledge gained from a commission sin. Even better if there's a study attached. I know he has these examples in him, terrible as they may be. Like this part from the original's Rule 6, where he talked about the damage from Hurricane Katrina having been preventable. It doesn't even require any reframing, he's already got it in the sin context. Why is he being so stingy with examples in this book?
Second error. Freud assumed that things experienced are things understood. In accordance with that assumption, he believed that a memory trace existed somewhere in the mind that accurately represented the past, like an objective video recording. These would be reasonable presumptions if our experience was simply a series of objectively real and self-evident events transmitted through our senses, thought about, evaluated, and then acted upon. If this was all true, dramatic experience would be accurately represented in memory, even when pushed out of awareness by unconscious mechanisms. Or conscious, but Freud presumed the former, because of its understood but terrible nature. However, neither reality nor our processing of reality is as objective or articulated as Freud presupposed.
Cool. It's time to talk repression some more before getting to another hypothetical unhappy married couple. Yes, Peterson is correct in that memory is not a perfect, unbiased recording of events. An event will be encoded into long-term storage with parts missing, parts filled in, other bits of bias or context attached. But, as I said earlier, we don't have evidence that a memory can be repressed down to haunt us.
A few moments later.
You look like you need a nap.
Later that same evening. Much later.
What we can do is lose the retrieval cues for a memory and refine those cues later. So a common one to experience is a smell, bringing back a memory you hadn't thought about in ages. There's even a turn of phrase about this where I would have thought I'd forgotten that. It's not that you forgot the memory or had repressed it down or anything, it's just you lost the ability to find that memory in storage. Repression would require a part of your mind or personality to assess a memory as negative, go, right, this is shitty and painful, I don't want to feel this anymore, and bin it in the unconscious, and then lose the retrieval keys intentionally. All of this happening without your conscious awareness to protect you from painful things. Things that are generally pretty difficult for people to forget. And also a pretty imperfect way of dealing with all of this, given their apparent propensity to rattle around like poltergeists. Complicating things is we generally find out about repressed memories after they've been recovered. And that is a whole topic for another series, which I do still owe my patrons, so I know. Very quick version. We have sufficient reason to believe that false memories, so things that didn't happen to a person, can be implanted into a person's memory, even with the best intentions by the practitioner who's doing the recovery. And it seems like these false memories are actually what's being recovered. Hypothetical spouse, Hypothetical spouse, story time. Your partner has been ignoring you for months, and you happen upon them having a friendly chat with a, quote, attractive neighbor. Peterson says your processing of that event rarely follows the flow of perception to conscious thought to emotional response to action. Instead, it's, quote, bottom up.
You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
He says your processing is more likely emotion to, and I don't know. He just leaves it there. He tried to go there, so we're actually going to go there. Bottom up and top down processing. And to just get you oriented for the top and bottom convention here, bottom or lower, we're talking about earlier in the processing stream and less complex, so sensory information that's coming in. Top down, we're talking about higher cognitive processes or more complexity. Okay, so with bottom up processing, You have the physical stimulus, as shown in the picture, all the sights, sounds, and smells associated with brewing coffee. That stimulus gets transduced by the sensory receptors, which leads to neural activity being passed up to the cortex. This would be the more bias and intention-free of the two. For top-down processing, your experiences, feelings, drives, whatnot, impact lower processing. To know a certain smell is coffee, you'd need to have previous experience with it and so a memory of it. Needing to have your coffee could make the smell more pleasurable or intense than if you're satiated. Emotions can come into play from the bottom or top, be it from a biologically prepared emotional stimulus or from internal thoughts. Right, so bottom up and top down processing for Peterson's hypothetical spouse chatting with the neighbor. Bottom up would be the basic visual info getting passed upstream into higher and more complex cognitive processing. Top down would mean the emotional context of being neglected for a couple months coloring how the interaction is perceived, which sounds more in line with what Peterson was describing as bottom up. But importantly, this isn't an either-or situation. Both happen. You've got the basic info coming in from the senses and the contextual info coming in from the top, and your conscious experience basically happening somewhere in between the two. So add this apparent butchering of psych jargon to the annoyance pile for this section. Continuing with what he calls bottom-up processing of just having your emotional response, he says that you might not even be aware of where your feelings are coming from, what the root cause of the problem actually is. There are any number of possibilities for the cause, presented in the order he discusses them. You having trouble at work leads to you having lower confidence, which leads to rejection sensitivity, which is noticed at home. Just popping in for a sec to, again, point out that this would be a top-down thing, not bottom-up. Or your spouse could actually be ignoring you, which could be an indication of an affair on the horizon followed by a divorce. Either situation is bad, but it will only be made worse if you do nothing to address it. I do somewhat agree with Peterson here. Figuring out the central reason behind a feeling, especially a negative one, can be hard, and the difficulty is only compounded when a loved one is part of that tangled mess of emotions. But therapists can be part of the process of untangling that unhappiness ball. Something that will eventually sort of be the gist of Peterson's advice here is to talk to your partner. In the case of this example, tell them that you feel like you haven't been getting as much attention and affection from them, and is everything okay? Maybe it's that trouble at work you're having making it more difficult to actually interact with you. Maybe they have something going on in their personal lives that's making them withdraw into themselves. Maybe it's not something they were intending to do, but it is something that they can work on now that you brought it up. Or maybe it is, yeah, they have intentionally been ignoring you, and now that you bring it up, we need to have a talk. Whatever the case may be, it's important to rip that band-aid off now. Figure out what's going on so you can work on making it better. Or, if you run that advice through the style madness filter, do not hide unwanted things in the fog. This section ends with some philosophical musings on the answer to the question, what really happened? Being difficult, if not impossible, to objectively answer. Paraphrasing and distilling and everything the rest of it to pull out the advice. Things can be made a little bit more clear when communication is open and honest. I just want to note how hard I had to reframe things to get that advice. It's sort of included, or at least the inversion of it is included, when he's talking about how domestic arguments can get out of hand, that they do so because continual and effective communication has never been established. It's almost a little funny that the advice to have effective communication with your partner is obfuscated to the point it is in his writings. And trust me, it doesn't get any less foggy as we continue in this chapter. And on that foggy little hint of a tease for what's coming, that's it for this video. Until next time, bye!